Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. In St. Louis, for more than 140 years, the city has annually celebrated with a Veiled Prophet Parade. Established first in 1878, wealthy business people, upper-class social elites, powerful moneyed interests threw one hell of a good party to honor our American values. But what happened in St. Louis in 1877, just 1 year earlier? Could it be it was the first time workers took control of a major American city that was ruled by a communist party? Oh my, there's a good story here. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings, everybody. I'm here with my friend Greg and a new friend, MarkKruger. And welcome to our podcast, Mark.
Thank you, Pat. I appreciate your having me.
Well, I give it a little background about you. You were previously taught in several universities, including St. Louis University, and started off as went to Madison, Wisconsin, and became a lawyer and a municipal judge, and then ended up finishing your career in academia. And your book that we came across is this book here, The St. Louis Commune of 1877, Communists in the Heartland. And I discovered this book when my wife was reading Mother Jones magazine, and Mother Jones magazine indicated our readers thought these were one of the best books of 2012, and your book was on that regarding the St. Louis Commune. Tell me a little bit about this book and how you chose the topic, and give me some background on it.
Okay, I just to go back to the beginning of what you had mentioned. I was a junior in college in Madison, and I was living with two graduate students, TAs, and I said, I think I'll go to graduate school. And one of them said to me, no, that was for people our age. People your age need to go to law school because the movement is going to need lawyers. That was in 1969. So I went to law school and I practiced law for about 30 years. And during that time, I kept thinking, should I have gone to graduate school? It was still in my mind. And so I went back and got a PhD thinking that, well, maybe I'll teach one day, maybe I won't. And I ended up at St. Louis University. And I was reading some books on labor history through the years. And when they got to the 1877 railroad strike, a number of them would have a few lines or a small paragraph, and they would say something to the effect, and in St. Louis, workers took control of the city. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? How come nobody's ever written about that? Nobody in St. Louis even knows about it, So I kept thinking that deserves a book on its own. But you know how when you're working, you're busy with this and that, and you put it off and you figure. So when I retired, I immediately got started on it. And what I discovered was something that I hadn't really thought of, and that is the background of it, of why St. Louis. Why did it happen in St. Louis and not someplace else? And that's what the book was about, kind of tracing it back to the roots of the St. Louis Commune in 1877, where it came from, why it developed as it did, and why it ended up in St. Louis.
Well, we previously had on a guest, Jeffrey Fox, who wrote a very good book. It was a fiction book, but it could have been easily nonfiction, about the Paris Commune. And the sequence of things that happened here, that was 1870, a fascinating kind of explosion of activism in Paris that was snuffed out. And this is 7 years later, and it's the Great Railroad Strike starts about then, 1877. And Great Depression after Civil War, a lot of people out of work, and the people with power and money were controlling things. Tell me about the Great Railroad Strike and how that set the stage for what we're going to be talking about here in St. Louis.
Well, in 1873 and 1874, there was a number of strikes by railroad workers around the country. And they all had to do with the working conditions of railroad workers in the United States. It was a very, very dangerous job. And the fact that wages were low in the industry. And then in 1877, led by the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, railroads all over the country began cutting wages. Now, that was partially due to the 1873 Depression that businesses suffered from. But at the same time, those railroads were paying dividends of 8 to 10% to their shareholders at the same time as they were cutting wages. So they were making money, those were. And they cut the wages of the railroad workers 3 times in about a year. The workers were making about 50% of what they had been making. And wages were so low that they really couldn't live. They couldn't heat their homes in the winter. They couldn't feed their families. And a strike broke out in Martinsburg, West Virginia in the summer of 1877 and Baltimore. And that spread west like wildfire day by day. Towns along the railroad lines would go out on strike. They'd hear about the strikers in the next town. They'd go out on strike. And that spread west. And ultimately, on the 21st of July in 1877, it reached East St. Louis, Illinois, which is right across the river from St. Louis, and which was a big railroad center. So that was the beginning of the strike then in St. Louis in July of 1877.
And the railroads were scoundrels in a way. And you said something I was unaware of this. Is it called deadheading, or what happens when you put an engine on the front and the back and you double the number of cars?
Yeah, double headers.
Oh, double headers, not deadheading, double headers.
Yeah, I think the basic train had about 18 cars, and what the railroads decided was that it was much cheaper. You didn't need as many workers to run double headers. That was with a locomotive in the front and one in the back, and twice as many cars. And so the workers were doing twice as much work for the same pay, and it was a lot more dangerous with that many cars. And so that was one of the big issues in the 1877 strike.
Yeah, they had to literally manually set the brakes and go from cart to cart, and half the crew, and it was really dangerous.
Right. They'd fall off, they'd lose a hand or a leg. It was a very dangerous job, brakeman was at that time.
So this wildfire of activism and strikes ends up in St. Louis, and St. Louis is connected to the Paris Commune in a way, because a lot of the Germans that came from Germany ended up settling in East St. Louis and St. Louis, and it was more than half the town was Germans, would you say?
Right. I think in 1877, 60% of St. Louis of the population was foreign born, and a full third of the population was born in Germany. They came over. The Germans came to St. Louis largely in the 1830s and the 1840s, following revolutions and bad harvests and that sort of thing in Germany, in the German-speaking countries during those years.
They were tough son of a guns. They were, they were, and a lot of them were fine craftsmen that had lost their jobs with the Depression that had occurred. And as a part of that group, there was something called the Working Man's Party, which was it a union? Was it an affiliation? Tell me about the Working Man's Party that was prominent in St. Louis at that time.
Well, the Working Men's Party of the United States was founded in 1876, a year before the railroad strikes. And it was an growth of the International Workers Association, the First International, which was formed by Karl Marx in 1864. So the First International was founded in London, was a European organization that sought to unite workers around the world. And in 1872, Marx moved the headquarters from London to New York for political reasons. The anarchists within the organization were, he was afraid they were going to take it over. And so they moved to New York in 1872. And then in 1876, they held a convention. There was a split within the organization between Marx and Ferdinand Lassalle. And they came together in the United States, those two groups, in what they called the Unity Convention in 1876. They decided to dissolve the First International, and they formed in its place the Working Men's Party of the United States. So that was really the first Marxist party, Communist party in the United States. And it was, it had a number of members in St. Louis who were going to go on and lead the St. Louis Commune and the general strike in St. Louis in 1877.
I think the remarkable thing about the book is how you weave together clarity about Marx, which you seldom find in historical accounts, the First International, which not everyone does justice to, the Revolution of 1848, and German immigration, and that coming together in St. Louis in such an intriguing way. But your book weaves it together so impressively. I can't say enough about it, how this comes together and puts a situation, creates a situation in the United States of all places, in St. Louis of all places, that's revolutionary.
I really, yeah. When I began looking at it, I looked at the St. Louis Commune itself and what had happened in St. Louis in July in 1877. And again, I asked the question, why St. Louis? And who were these people? Did they want to take over the entire country? Did they only want to take over St. Louis? What did they want to do? And as I looked at them, there were certain things that emerged. And one, it was that there were a lot of Germans in the group. There were a number of French people in the group. And the French had been involved in the Paris Commune in 1871. The Germans, a lot of the Germans had fought in the 1848 revolution in Germany, which was suppressed, and they were forced to leave the country. And a lot of them came to the United States. And at the time, St. Louis had a very large German population going back to around the 1830s. Some Germans had come to St. Louis, and then they went back and wrote pamphlets and books singing the praises of St. Louis to their countrymen, suggesting that they moved to St. Louis. They said the United States was a republic, which is what they wanted and what a lot of the revolutionaries in 1848 wanted, and that the climate was good, the agriculture was good, and that there was a big German community so they could get by with the German language. They'd have a familiar German culture. And so a lot of the Germans from 1848 came to St. Louis, and a lot of those were Marxists. They were communists or socialists. Joseph Wedemeyer was a friend of Karl Marx, his literary agent in the United States. And Frederick Engels told him, when you go to the United States, don't go to Boston or Philadelphia, go to St. Louis. That's where all the Germans are. And that's what he did. And so all of this came together. These French revolutionaries, these German revolutionaries, all came together in St. Louis, were active in the labor movement. And when the strike broke out, they were members of the Working Men's Party, and they took control of the strike and tried to lead it during the summer of 1877.
Let's back up just a little bit. Your book was interesting, and I think it was in your book you were talking about how Marx didn't think that the Paris Commune would work because you needed to have a powerful organization of labor, and it had to be they had to have their act together in order to take on these private capital and government power, and he didn't think that they were well organized enough. So here with the Working Man's Party, they're somewhat organized. You know, they seem to have their act together a lot more than that just spontaneous eruption of in Paris. Tell me about how they took over the city.
Well, the Working Men's Party was, you know, Marx, that was the big disagreement between Lassalle and Marx. Marx felt that the working class was young, that it hadn't really developed its maturity, its class consciousness, and that you had to build up working class organizations first, make them strong, then you could engage in politics. Otherwise, he thought the workers would engage in politics, but they would really just support the capitalist parties and they'd be exploited by them. And so Lassalle, on the other hand, thought, no, you've got to have a political solution to these problems, and you've got to run for office, and you've got to take control of the government that way. So that was the split. The Working Men's Party in the United States was kind of a compromise between the two. They talked about, well, we've got to build up our working class organizations, but in places where the time seems right and the working class is strong, we can go ahead and run for office. So they had a national organization in the United States, but it's like anything else. I mean, out of so many people, how many really are revolutionaries, right? And so in terms of numbers within the country, it was small. In terms of a revolutionary organization, it was pretty good size. There were 1,000 members of the Working Men's Party in St. Louis alone. And when the strike broke out, you know, it started in the East, let's say Baltimore, and spread west, and the Working Men's Party was really not active in any of those cities. It took a few days to reach St. Louis, and that gave them some time to think about what was happening and what they wanted to do about it. So when the strike got to St. Louis, they tried to take control of the strike in St. Louis. They organized other workers besides the railroad workers, and they turned it into a general strike. And that's considered to be the first general strike in American history. So that was something the Working Men's Party did. Then the city fathers, so to speak, were even less ready for this than the Working Men's Party was. And so they didn't do anything. And the Working Men's Party ended up taking control of the city, largely like they did in Paris, in the Paris Commune, where the city officials kind of abandoned the scene, and there was a vacuum to fill, and they filled that vacuum.
And they let the mail go through, right?
Yeah,
That was about it. Anything else you needed to go to them to kind of negotiate where government was before, they were after, correct?
Where the government was before.
The Working Men's Party took over those operations.
Yeah, it took over those operations. They thought if they stopped the mail, the first thing the federal government would do would step in and suppress them, saying that they were doing it because they interfered with the mail. So they even when the railroad companies refused to carry the mail, the workers sent a telegram to the president saying that it was the companies that was stopping it. They'd be glad to carry the mail themselves. So that was a way to keep the federal government out and keep them from getting involved in the strike.
You mentioned Marx's criticism of the Commune in your book, that it was not audacious enough, that they did not, for example, in Paris, the workers did not attack Versailles. They did not go after power. They weren't active in terms of that. And I think there's the same criticism in your book of a working man's organization as well, that they didn't actively pursue grabbing power. I'm reminded of Lenin, whose probably most popular quote is audacity, audacity, audacity. You don't just fill the vacuum that's empty, but you go after your adversary. You go attack. You go in the attack. They didn't seem to know. The way I read your book, they didn't seem to know what to do with the power.
I think that's true because, you know, in Paris, the big criticism was that well, certain people like Blanqui wanted to attack Versailles, where the French government had retreated to. And the French troops at that time were being held by the Prussians, who had just won the Franco-Prussian War and were holding the French troops hostage. So Blanqui said, go after, let's attack Versailles. They don't have any troops now. We can take over the French government. But the Paris Commune decided, well, that seems almost illegitimate. Let's hold elections so we can claim to be a legitimate government, and so on and so forth. And they wasted that time and gave Versailles a chance to amass its forces, get a deal with the Prussians, and counterattack. The same thing kind of occurred in St. Louis. Again, the Working Men's Party wasn't really prepared for this, and I think really hesitated. They weren't quite sure what to do. The U.S. Army at the time only had about 15,000 troops, and most of those were on the frontier fighting Indians. So the question was, how far could this strike in 1877 go? Had the workers taken over the city? Had they tried to expand it? Because there was a nationwide strike of railroad workers and other workers. Could they have gone farther than they did? And again, like the Paris Commune, like as you point out, they hesitated. They weren't sure what to do. There was disagreement, and as a result, they didn't do a whole lot. They did in St. Louis. They had a general strike. They closed down businesses, but they also gave the government time to react and harness their forces and counterattack.
Right. Mark, we've done a lot of podcasts with the theme of union activism that was controlled and organized through the United States Communist Party. For example, we had Tony Gilpin on, who talked about the Farm Equipments Union in the Midwest and how that was this little communist group of people that were responsible for a lot of positive changes. We had Roger Karen on, who had the same discussion regarding the auto industry. The auto industry was really, the foundation of union organization was done with this small group of people. And it seems like, and again, you're probably more an expert on this, Greg, than I, but it seems like that those people who are Marxist have this kind of passionate social justice foundation in how they respond and see events. When they took over the city in St. Louis, what did they want? They wanted a reasonable working week. They wanted no child labor. They wanted to have better housing. They wanted to have having a sense of control of what's going on in your workplace. These were very radical ideas at the time, but those are the same themes that are carried up through the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, until the Red Scare kind of did away with these people within our society. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that, Mark?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, they're all working class issues, and the working class has struggled throughout American history, and sometimes worse off than other times. Back in the 1830s and 40s, I cite a study out of New York that showed 30 people living in one room in a tenement building, 300 living in one house, people sleeping in police stations. Life was very, very tough for these people, and they earned just enough to survive. And working conditions were bad; they were dangerous, and there was no social safety net. So these were all things that, for example, the Paris Commune demanded, and laws that the Paris Commune passed to aid working people. And in this country, at various times in American history, the working class was better off than at other times, but the issues are always the same. The working class safety. When I was a kid, all my friends' fathers were members of unions, and they all lived in middle-class subdivisions. Their mothers didn't work. One income was supporting the family. And although people seem to be pretty well off, at least in recent years, the economy has changed, and now it's just standard for both parents to be working so that the family can survive. Um, the service industry has replaced some of the better jobs. People are working for more minimum wages. They're demanding an increase in minimum wage, which is um, fought against by the more right-wing parties. And so the issues, I think, throughout history are the same for the working class. And the Marxist parties, being representatives of the working class, are going to focus on those issues. And those issues have pretty much remained the same, I think.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So across the country, the response to this strike wasn't pretty. We had, 100,000 workers went on strike. There were thousands of people were locked up in prison. Hundreds of people were killed by police and by other government organizations. Some parts of the strike were railroad cars were burned. It was pretty violent. So we can't say that we were immune to the violence of the Paris Commune, because it was a response to that strike. There was a heavy hand that came down on these people.
The Paris Commune scared the hell out of the rich people in this country. It had happened only 6 years prior, where the workers had taken control of Paris. And, the killings were mostly on the side of the government, but a minimum of 30,000 people were killed during that time, that 3 months of the Paris Commune. And some estimates are 100,000. In the United States, there was a lot, many fewer killed, but it was the rich people were very much afraid, because the Paris Commune was still in their minds, and the bloodshed. It was only 6 years before, when you think of that, and so the first thing they thought of was, it's going to be another Paris Commune. The workers are going to take control. They're going to take away our property. They're going to do all these horrible things, and the streets are going to be full of blood. And they reacted to that in order to protect themselves the way they needed to do that. They marshaled forces. They got the federal government involved, the state government. They got private industry involved to force their workers to join these militias to go out and suppress the workers. And they treated it very seriously. They were afraid.
Why do you suppose this is kind of an unknown piece of labor history? I mean, you can read a lot of mainstream labor histories that are very good and honest about covering the Molly Maguires and the violence that was there. Even the CIO days, you can find honest. But it's interesting to me that, apart from maybe Bonner's book on the working class, you see no mention of this rising in St. Louis. No mention of this working man's party, and how only 1,000 people could serve as a vanguard and drive this thing into a general strike, into a veritable revolution. Why is there no mention in most histories? I mean, I didn't know this, and I've read a lot of labor history.
Yeah, and even in people in St. Louis, the funny thing is that after the railroad strike was suppressed in St. Louis, the rich people got together and started this veiled profit organization. And the idea was they would hold a parade every year and parade through the streets and really send a message that the streets belong to us. We're the leaders of this community, the rich people, you're not. And they were going to do this on an annual basis. And they've done it every year since then. And today, they have a big 4th of July celebration. They have the Veiled Prophet Queen, where all the rich people send their daughters to enter society and meet other rich people that they can marry. The Veiled Prophet thing is well known in St. Louis to this day, but its origins have been totally buried. I mean, since I wrote this, people are saying, wow, I didn't know that's where the veiled prophet came from. It's this big city celebration every year, but no one knows that it was a celebration of the suppression of the working class in 1877. And as far as the commune itself, nobody in St. Louis seems to have known about that. There was only one book that I really found on the commune, and that was written in the 1960s by a guy named David Burbank, who was a librarian at Washington University in St. Louis. And that gave a good day-by-day description taken from basically newspaper articles at the time, that sort of thing. It raised the question in my mind, why St. Louis, why these people, who were they, and so on. I can't say that I found any evidence of intentional suppression of the story of the commune, but it could be that radical or leftist professors who write books on labor history talk about it to some extent, limited extent, because in terms of what it did, it only lasted a week, so it wasn't exactly the big story of the 1877 strike. I thought it was important because it was the first general strike in the United States and the only time when communists took control of a city government. So I thought that in and of itself was a story. But I think that the mainstream historians just kind of pass it by, either purposefully or just because they don't see the significance of it.
I would strongly recommend people Google veiled prophet, and there are articles in The Nation, The Atlantic. You can't make this stuff up. It's almost like a Fellini film or something. They would dress people up. They would have like one leader of the parade, which would be covered. And oftentimes the covering looked a lot like Ku Klux Klan outfits. And it was I think the first one was the police chief that got rid of all the rabble the year before, but it's some businessman or some sort of wealthy person. In reading those articles, it is absolutely bizarre, and only the past year or so, are people saying, wait a second, why are we honoring these people, this private capital that defeated a general labor strike 140 years ago every single year? Why are we, I don't know. It's strange. Is it to you?
It's almost like France in the 1600s, with Versailles and all the royalty parading through the streets, with their purple colors and so on. It's almost the same thing. And the origins of it have not been bragged about by the people putting it on today. And now that, I think, is an intentional cover-up.
Right.
They don't want people to know. They know where it came from, but they don't want people to know that. But you're right. It's always the veiled prophet himself is always a very rich person, secret, always very rich. And their daughters are introduced to society. And then they put on this big municipal celebration that everybody goes and watches fireworks and the parade and so on, not knowing the history of it.
Right. And didn't they change it to the America's Parade, or they're trying to morph it a little bit into something other than what it was? Or isn't it the America's celebration or something? I don't know.
Through the years, they have changed it, and they made it a big 4th of July celebration now. And they call it the VP Fair, so they don't stress the veiled prophet, even though he's still part of the celebration. So yeah, they really have tried to get away from their original origins, but it's still made up of people who are invited to be members, rich people. There are no poor people in the organization.
Right.
Yeah.
So before we got on, both Greg and I were chatting about how much we enjoyed your book. And I was halfway through it and sent Greg an email saying, "Oh my God, this is really good." And Greg, when he was done with it, said, "This is one of the better books we've reviewed." How did you become such a good writer when this is your first book? This thing is, it's footnoted, it's academic, but it has this conversational tone to it. Why are you such a good writer for your first book?
Well, I really appreciate your saying those things, because the St. Louis Post-Dispatch did a review of it when it came out, and they said the exact opposite, that it was full of what do they call it? Academic prose and dry and so on. It was a hatchet job, actually, saying exactly the opposite of what you did. And you know, I've always considered myself a decent writer. You know, I was editor of my high school newspaper, you know, that sort of thing. And so law, when I was a lawyer, I always thought they kind of ruined my writing style, because, you know, legal briefs have to be very, you know, short and precise, and you don't discuss things, you just set out the precedents and so on. And I always felt that they were trying to ruin my ability to write. But when I've always enjoyed writing, and I've written a number of articles. I did publish my my dissertation, which was on communes in the United States, centering on a 60s commune in southern Missouri. That's still there, by the way. It's kind of interesting. East Wind Community started in the late 60s, and it's been very successful. And they still operate today. They've got a good business. They make good money, and it's a very healthy community. So I was always kind of interested in those issues, and I appreciate your thoughts on the book. But
Well,
I honestly have to say not everybody has agreed with you.
Well, if you makes you feel any better, we interviewed Walter Johnson, who I think, wouldn't you say, Greg, is one of the top 5 scholars on slavery in the country, a Harvard professor. He wrote the book on St. Louis, and the St. Louis Dispatch did a hit job on him also.
I wasn't aware of that. Is that right?
Oh yeah, that some reporter who just thought he had access to all of the archives, and he, you know, got a couple of dates wrong, and you thought that he was, you know, I don't know. It was an absolutely overreaction to sort of minor little inconsistencies in the book. It was a gotcha piece, and it really was inappropriate, because that Walter Johnson is, if he's not anything, he's one of the best historians we have in our country right now. He's a remarkable historian.
You made my day with that. I didn't realize that.
I'll see if
But
I can. I'll see if I can find you. And he's addressed it a couple of times very professionally, just going, you know.
My own perch, which is a little different than Pat's, but I've read a great deal, a good bit on Marx and Engels, and a good bit of the history of the 19th century regarding radical movements. And I found the book so fair. I mean, it's very difficult to find, you know, you always go searching for a person's political disposition. Well, they're saying that because this is their outlook. They're saying it because it's the other. I found yours to be so incredibly even. I mean, of course, I agree with most of it. That may be the problem. But I thought it was very even-handed. I thought it was a very fair approach to Marx. I mean, it was very condensed, so you didn't go deeply into Marxian theory, but you gave a reasonable, responsible, and fair rendering. Paris Commune is a lightning rod, and much is written about it from different perspectives. And you gave a very fair and very honest, but most importantly, connecting all these things in a way that made historical sense, which frankly, most, if not, certainly many, if not most historians can't do. They don't know how to do that. And
thank you, Greg.
Remarkable.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Well,
Yeah, it was, you know, I can't take credit. You know, once I realized that the 1848 revolution was a part of this, that the Paris Commune, at the first internet, and that all these things were a part of it, it kind of wrote itself that way because logically you could see how it all came together. You know, all these different factors and forces came together in one city. The railroad strike was in other cities, but you didn't have that Marxist German population in those other cities. The strong working men's party, and that's why it came together in St. Louis. So it was a logical kind of story to tell.
Yes.
So, go ahead, Greg.
Well, that's the impression. That's the most impressive aspect is that the logic was there. That you know, it cries out for explanation. Why St. Louis? Why this radical? Why this unusual, different first time general strike in America? But all those components coming together, and the spark being the 1877 railroad strike. But Pittsburgh was far bloodier. But
Right.
there weren't the same conditions. There weren't the same working man's party operant. It wasn't the same kind of direction given to that movement. But it was really bloody where I live in Pittsburgh. We have the sign on Liberty Avenue detailing all the loss of lives, and it was just incredible. But in St. Louis, it was productive because of something, and it was that connection you put together between the Paris Commune and the French, the Germans in 1848, 1830 revolutions, and the connection through Wedemeyer and Marx. I mean, it really was beautifully woven together, and it's missing from so much history because it does explain why something happens here and not somewhere else.
Yeah, I appreciate that. If I was gonna sell it to the movies, I'd be better off writing about Pittsburgh or Chicago because that's where all the violence was, and there wasn't really much violence, if any, in St. Louis. But it's what attracted me to the St. Louis portion was the fact that the theory and the people involved and the conclusions, the Marxism that was present, that wasn't present in those other cities as much.
Here's a last the last sentence in an article on the Working Men's Party. In 1877, working people learned that they were not united nor powerful enough to defeat the pact of private capital and government power. Could we be writing about right now? It's the same thing. We're having inklings of a couple of Starbucks stores being organized and flirting with Amazon, but we still don't have enough power to really remarkably change things.
Right. I really like that quote by William Faulkner, where he says, "The past is not dead; it isn't even past." You know, and you're right. It's the same problem over and over and over again. It shows you how hard the struggle is to take power from those people because they're very powerful. I mean, I thought in the 1960s, the late 60s, I thought there'd be some really major changes in American society. I mean, if it wasn't going to happen then, when was it going to happen? You know, and today, you know, it looks like we're worse off than we were back then,
right?
Except for the war in Vietnam, you know.
So
let me be provocative. Let me be a little provocative. On a positive side, I think 1,000 people, 1,000 members of the Working Man's Party in St. Louis could push this so far. I mean, it reminds me of Lenin's newspaper was called the Spark. Iskra was the Spark, and the notion was a vanguard, a small group of really dedicated revolutionaries, can multiply their intensity of commitment tenfold, 100-fold, as it did in Russia. But you see the same phenomena there, do you not? That small group of people could serve as a spark. And that was so unique in US history because you don't have too many times where, I mean, Americans are not disposed to that kind of organizational structure, that kind of dedication and vanguardism, if you will. They're more disposed to like our friends at Occupy. It's all get together and do it. And it doesn't happen. But there it happened uniquely. It happened uniquely, as Pat mentioned earlier, in the 30s in organizing the CIO. But it seems to have happened when you had that kind of a commitment, that kind of a political role that people accepted.
Yeah, and leadership, right?
And leadership, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, because you mentioned the Occupy movement, and I remember when that happened, they were very proud of the fact that they had no leadership, and it was so democratic. And my first thoughts, oh no, this is like SDS in the late '60s, where no one was in charge. A meeting would last for 12 hours, nothing would be accomplished, and this was not the way to do it. And sure enough, it fizzled out. So you need that kind of leadership to continue. But I don't know the answer to it, but you talk about a spark, and there's the guy Dacus, who was writing at the time in 1877, says, they could have taken over the country back then. They didn't want to, they didn't try to, but they could have taken over the government. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, there was this major strike across the country. If the other workers had joined in every city, could they have done that? There were only 15,000 troops in the American Army at the time. So, these are all questions that I don't know the answer to, but it had the spark, but it didn't catch enough. And maybe it reinforces what Marx was saying, is that the working class was young there. He said the 1877 strike would be suppressed. So I don't know the answer to that. If I did, I guess I don't know. But I think you're right. I mean, what causes that to happen?
Yeah, and I was reading that article about you in The Scene, which was a local a university newspaper. They did a bio on you, and you've been involved in social justice issues for a long time. So people don't know this, but you used to sell Black Panther newspapers on the side of the street and such.
Yeah, in the late '60s. Well, I guess it was in 1970. I left Madison, went to law school at Washington University, and somehow came into contact with local Black Panthers. And the thing I always liked about the Panthers was that they weren't racist, that this was the period of the Black Power movement, and that sort of thing. And a lot of groups didn't want whites participating in their group, and they thought that whites would try to take over the group and so on and so forth. And but the Panthers weren't like that. They had a class analysis, and they didn't mind working with white people. So I always got a kick out of the fact that this little white guy on this white campus was selling the Black Panther newspaper, and the students were buying it. So
and giving them advice on gun rights and
right.
and
Right.
legal advice as you go. That was nice.
Because we were students, we didn't know the answers. We had to kind of hit the library and find out.
And
we have to warn, Pat, we have to start warning people.
I
When
know.
they agree to be on the show, they have to understand that you're going to dig into their life. You're going to bring up things that they've
That's
long
right.
forgotten.
That's right.
They may be embarrassed about. But Pat is absolutely incredible about his research.
Well, I
He
did.
knows your girlfriends. He won't bring them up, but he knows it.
Yeah, when you write your book about the commune, are you going to be covering Stevens Farm in Central Tennessee? Stephen
Well,
Gaskin?
I wrote it 20 some years ago. I think I did mention him in there because at Eastwind, when I was interviewing people down there was a girl who was born on the farm.
Right.
Her parents had left her there to be born there. Well, she was born there and they left her there, and she grew up there, and then she ended up at the Eastwind community. So she had spent her whole life in these intentional communities.
Well,
so, yeah,
before
I had
my-
gone through. Go ahead.
Well, before my
gone-
wife and I were married, we drove our Volkswagen van down to Stevens Farm, and we're thinking of joining it. So
Oh, really?
done that, I'd be in a different trajectory right now. So
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. Well, it was an interesting time.
right. And the other thing that I think in regarding your career, these are little known facts, is that you were a municipal judge and you got fired and you were a bad municipal judge because you weren't fining people enough. Is that correct? You weren't into
Yeah.
the Ferguson model of how municipalities are supposed to extract wealth from poor people.
exactly. The St. Louis has 96 little municipalities in St. Louis County.
Right.
And each one of them has their own police force, their own court system, and so on. And I was a judge in two of them, just 2 nights a month kind of thing. And one of them was a very poor, largely 96% Black community. And we actually were about 20 years, I was affiliated with that city for a long time because I had been city attorney, and it was the first all Black, all women mayor and board of aldermen in the country. And we had our picture, in all the national papers. And it looked funny because there were all these Black women, and in the middle of them was this little white guy, as the city attorney. So it was a very poor, primarily Black city. And one of these women ultimately became the mayor. And the problem is they had no tax base in the city. And so, they didn't have money to pay the police. They didn't, the police that they hired would have been fired at 2 other departments before they ever got there. And they were basically supporting the city through the courts. And we'd have these big fights over these fines. And the population was very poor. They didn't have money to pay all these fines, And so I tried to find alternatives for them. So for example, if they were driving without a license, I'd continue their case every month until they got a license. And then I would dismiss them, let them pay court costs, but no fine, and so on. Because that was the whole idea, right? Was to get them to get a license. Then they'd have insurance, but anyway, so yeah, we did have, I did have words with the mayor over that. And ultimately, I got fired from it after I had been the city attorney, the city prosecutor, and the city judge over a 25-year period. But I finally lost it over that issue.
Well, you should be very proud of being fired, Mark. That's. I would put that on my resume.
Yeah, well, it blew up right after that. And my wife had said, boy, are you lucky you got fired, because about 3 months later, all these municipal judges were on the front page of the Post-Dispatch, pictures of them, and all these little cities and what they were doing in them. And my picture wasn't among them because I was gone for 3 months by that time. So it turned into lawsuits, all kinds of things, a big issue. Yeah. So yeah, it was one of the more positive things that happened in my life.
Good.
So what are your plans? What are your plans to write more? Pat knows more about it because he researches it more than I do. But what's your next project?
It's interesting you ask that, because I was just on the phone this morning with a friend in New York, and I said, at my age now, I'm not sure what kind of projects to get into. I don't want to start on a book that's going to take 5 or 6 years, because I don't want to get half done with it and let somebody else finish it up, So you raise a good question for senior people at this stage in our lives. What maybe having a podcast or something, or joining you, that would be something that would be positive, because you feel all your life, you feel like you've been doing something worthwhile. You've been helping people with this or that, or teaching them or whatever. And then all of a sudden you're retired, and you don't have that feeling of worth anymore. So it is important to find something to do. I'm still working on that. If you have suggestions, I'd appreciate that.
We'll send you some.
Okay.
Well, my one suggestion is everybody go out and get this book. It is a treat. It is well written. It's I hope you sell a few copies from this podcast. We'll see. My friends tend to like our recommendations, and yeah, and it's just great. So that's wonderful job. And this has been a treat talking to you. And I if I'm ever in St. Louis, I'll try to look you up and make you buy me a cup of coffee or something. How about
Please.
That?
Absolutely. I'd be glad to. I really appreciate your having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Good.
And and I appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure.
Good.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot,
much.
Mark.
All right. Thanks a lot. All right.
Look forward to that project.
Right. All right. Goodbye now.
Okay, bye-bye.